Welcome back, painters, for another episode of Mortal Realms Monday. This is the Road Painter bringing you another tutorial, and this week we are looking at the statue from the Sigmarite mausoleum as included in issue 15 of Mortal Realms magazine. So without further ado, let's take a look at this. Okay, so starting with the base, I'm using a combination of greys here, of Mechanica Standard Grey, Eshin Grey, and into those I've mixed a small amount of Thousand Suns Blue, and then for my highlight greys and dry brush and grey I'm using Dawnstone. But you can use whatever sort of grey that you want for this. I just wanted a little bit more of a bluish tone to my darker greys, so that's what I've gone with. So first of all, I'm just doing the stones around the base of the plinth section of the statue here, and I'm just picking off sort of individual ones at random. First of all with the Eshin Grey mix, and then I'll go on from this and pick off some more random ones with the Mechanica's Grey mix, and then the last few will be picked off with some of the Dawnstone. So I'll skip ahead and we can see what the finished result is of doing all the stones along the base here. Okay, so once the base has had a few thin down layers of paint applied, I'm going to take a medium shade brush and some non-oil. Now you could use Agrax Earth Shade for this if you wanted to. I just wanted a slightly darker, dingier tone to the look of the stones, so I've gone with the non-oil for this. So I'm just applying this all over the stonework here, and this will go over everything you can see there apart from the row of skulls around the outside edge. I am being quite liberal with this, you know, just dumping it in there and making sure that it fills up those cracks a little bit and the gaps between the stones. And then once that is complete, I will then sit it aside and let it dry for about 45 minutes, and whilst that's drying we can move on to the statue and start working on the statue itself, to save a little bit of time rather than waiting for this to dry and complete this and then moving on to the statue. We may as well get the statue done whilst this dries. So let's jump over to the statue and see how we get on with starting that. Okay, so for the statue I'm going to be using a combination of Ulthuan Grey, Mechanica's Standard Grey, and Dawnstone. So just going to move the base out of the way there. Now for the statue I wanted to give it a weathered look, so I'm using a really beat up brush here, where the bristles are all sprayed on the end and they're just, you know, pulled apart, but it gives this good stippling effect. You could also use an actual stippling brush if you have one, but I find, you know, old brushes, they work well. So all I'm doing is dipping this into the Ulthuan Grey, and I'm going to work from my lightest greys up to the dark, and I'm just applying this all over the plinth of the statue, or the column, and the statue itself. Obviously I'm not too bothered about hitting the roses with this. I'm just looking to get a nice coverage on it. Now it is important that you do this with a dry brush. If you do it with a wet brush, then your paint is going to tend to splodge on a little bit more rather than stipple on, and you'll end up with sort of larger patches on there. You will get the odd one with a brush like this, as it's not a dedicated stippling brush, but you know, try and keep the brush dry Also to note, I'm not rinsing the brush between colours here. I am literally just rubbing it across paper towel to get the paint off the brush, and then going straight into the next colour of paint. So at the minute, obviously just doing the stippling. You can see for the statue here, just going all over. With this colour, you want to cover the majority of it, and I have primed this in a grey. If you haven't, then I do recommend obviously painting a layer or two of grey on there first, as this won't work on a white statue, or at least it won't have the same outcome. So just making sure that I get into some of those deeper areas behind the cloak there, and obviously the flatter surface. And it is important to make sure that you use the tips of the bristles rather than the side of the brush, otherwise you'll get more of a patchwork look to it, or a patchy look, rather than a stippled look. Okay, so now working with the darker grey, again I'm just stippling over the entire statue, but with a slightly less coverage than the Ultron grey. You don't want to overpower this. If you do, not too much of a problem, just go back into Ultron and go back over all the darker areas. So you can see here, just getting a nice random stippling effect. Now this doesn't come together until the final step of this, which is applying a wash over it all. At the moment it will look more like an army camouflage or something, but trust me, the end result is definitely one to have a look at. Okay, so now that the stippling on the statue is done, I've got a pot of non-oil here. Now this is a sort of a bit of a custom mix. This has a about a 50-50 ratio of non-oil to water in this pot. It's an older pot of non-oil. Once it got to about halfway full, I filled it up, or topped it up with a bit of water. And what this does is thins down the non-oil a lot more, so that you don't get that heavy staining that you would do with concentrated non-oil. And all I'm doing with a shade brush, just applying this over the whole statue. You can see that it really settles down into those cracks nice, where it has been watered down a little bit. It doesn't want to take to the surface as much, and so it just stains the surface slightly. And you can see that it really pulls the stippling together from the greys. So I'm going to apply this over the whole piece, and then I'll go back in and just apply some more towards the sort of the cracks and the deeper recesses, just where you want it to settle a little bit more, and then I'll set that aside to dry, and we can start working on the base again. So we'll just jump ahead and have a look at what this looks like once the non-oil is on, and then we'll set that aside. Okay, so once the non-oil is on, this is what it would look like, and now it's time to let it dry. Right, and moving back to the base now, it's time to highlight our stone. So for this I'm taking some Dawnstone, and using a large dry brush, or I think for this I'm actually using the large base brush. I prefer this to a dry brush, but I'm just going over the entire base backwards and forwards motion, not being too careful with it, as I don't mind getting a little bit of a heavier layer over this, but we're just looking to pick off any of the raised edges, some of those sort of flatter surfaces that are roughed up a little bit, as well as the outside edges of the base there. So you can see just a very quick backwards and forwards motion, making sure to cover everything, and just very quickly dabbing the paint off the brush. Obviously with edges like this, we're just pulling downwards, catch across them, and then we can rough back over the top, and basically just do this until we are happy with the level of highlight that we have, and then you can stop whenever you want. So we'll jump on and see what this looks like once it's done, and then it will be time to move on to the skulls. Okay, and just quickly here, I'm doing the same thing with the statue, using that dawnstone, just giving a good dry brushing over the area to mainly pick off the sharp edges. Obviously with this area I'm coming in a downward stroke, and then backwards and forwards just across to pick up the vertical edges. But I'll do this over the whole statue, including the statue itself, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, so now moving on to the skulls, I'm using a combination of Ushapti bone and Zandri dust, with a 50-50 mix of the two as well for a third colour. And the same as I did with the stones, I'm just going around picking off random skulls first of all with the Zandri dust, and like I say, I'm just picking off one here, one there, maybe a couple together, and being sure to leave, you know, a few apart. And then once I've gone around and applied a couple of coats of this, I'll then go in with the 50-50 mix and do the same thing to some of the other skulls, and then again the remaining skulls will be coloured, or painted rather, with the Ushapti bone. And as always, my paints are slightly thinned down so that we can get a couple of coats on there. I'm not too worried about the paint pooling up in the eyes a little bit, as it is thinned. That will settle down as the paint dries and the water evaporates, and so once we put a wash over the top, that will fill those eyes in and darken them up anyway. So obviously being careful not to get any paint on the stonework that we've already done with these. I'm not too bothered about doing the gaps down in between the skulls, as the wash that we'll use will sort that out anyway. But if you want to, you could essentially paint that or fill that in with the Nuln Oil first when you were doing the stones, and then come back in and do the skulls, and obviously be careful not to get any of this skull colour down onto the under area there. So we'll jump ahead and take a look at what this is like once it's finished, and then we'll apply our shade. Right, so once all the skulls are done, I'm going to apply a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade Gloss, and I want the gloss one as it will give a little bit of shine to the skulls, but it also has less surface tension than the regular shades, and so that will sit down into those recesses a little bit easier. And again, I'm going straight from the pot here. The Ushapti bone has fully dried, so I'm not worried about contaminating the pot, and I'm literally soaking up some wash with the brush here, and you can see I'm just literally slopping it down into those gaps, filling it up, and then using the capillary action of the bristles, putting some of that back out and just sort of moving it around, covering the rest of the skulls. But I do get a good coverage on this with the wash, and so that's going to take probably around about an hour to dry fully. And it's important that you don't try to highlight the skulls, or move on to the next step of the base until that shade has fully dried. Otherwise you're going to start smearing a mix of the shade and your highlight colour all over your skulls, and it'll just ruin your piece, and that's not what we want. Okay, so whilst that shade is drying, I'm taking some Balthasar gold here, and I'm just picking off all the bits that I want to have that copperish look. So that's the little emblem on the front of the base here, and then I can set the base aside to dry. And then as you can see here, I wanted a couple of bits on the statue to be this copperish look, rather than going for the whole bronze statue or copper statue. I think it would be bronze, wouldn't it? So yeah, instead of the bronze statue, which I think looks a little bit too much sitting on top of the stone, I've decided to go with a stone statue with just a couple of bronze elements. So I'm just being careful to pick off the hourglass here, as well as the embossment on his shield, so the little skull and the piece around it, and also the sword and handle. You'll also notice here that I have painted the skull at the base of the statue's feet there. Now this is a bit of a horrible looking skull on this piece. It's got the elongated head that stretches back, so when painting it I just went round and painted the size of the skull that it should be, and left the rest of it behind it in the stone grey. And then all I'll do is apply some flock to give that moss effect, covering that stretched out back of the skull bit, and that fixes that up nicely. But if you want to, you can go ahead and paint the whole section of the skull in skull colour, or you could do it as a stone skull if you wanted to, and give it that more of a sculpted out look, and that there would be an excuse for it being the length that it is. Okay, so with all the Balthasar gold sections painted, I'm taking some of my watered down non-oil here, and I'm just going to dirty up all those bronze pieces by just applying this wash over the top of all of it, and that will just get down into some of those recesses, and it will also stain and dirty up the surface a little bit. So as you can see, I put a little bit too much, it went into the that little gap there, so I'm just using the bristles to pull it out and apply it up the sword. You'll also note on the column for the statue as well here that I did go ahead and paint these in the Balthasar gold as well. There's one here and one on the front. Right, so we'll set that aside and just do the one on the base here, and then we'll let all of that fully dry before coming back to the next step. Okay, so now I'm going to take some nihil oxide, and we're just going to give a bit of corrosion and oxidization to the bronze areas here. So just taking a small amount of this and just sort of applying it to anywhere that I think water would collect and, you know, start to corrode and eat away at that bronze and stain it. So all along the hourglass there, and apologies for this being just out of shot, but I am going up the length of the blade here and letting it collect a little bit down along the hilt. and then just tapping some of it off just so it doesn't leave that dull grey look to the entire blade, which nylock oxide tends to do when it dries. So do be careful on how much you apply over the piece. And I think that's about enough for there, so we'll skip on and start painting the flowers and roses at the base of the statue here. So for the leaves, first of all, I'm going to take some warpstone glow and some Caliban green, and also make a small mix of that. I think that's roughly a 2-to-1 of the warpstone to the Caliban. Right, so doing the same thing as I did with the skulls and the stonework, I'm just going to pick out random leaves with the each of the greens, starting with the darker ones and then moving to the lightest. That's just the order that I chose to do it this time. There are a couple of small vines that run between some of the roses on here, so do be sure to pick those out with the green as well, whichever green you prefer. I chose to do mine with the Caliban green. So again, just going over all the leaves with a couple of thin down coats, and then once that's all dried, we can apply a shade over the top. Obviously you've got some on the back here, and this can be done the same for the leaves on our buildings as well, and some of the other bases and the fences and walls. You know, the exact same thing, just picking off random leaves and then applying some shade and highlights. So let's jump ahead and take a look at the shading. Okay, so for the shading, I've gone with some Athonian camo shade, and again using the base brush here, I'm just applying some of this over all of the leaves, just so that it picks out that little groove that you have between the leaves, and it will also darken them up a little bit. So doing the same with the other side. If you're enjoying the video so far, then would be much appreciated if you could give it a thumbs up, and whilst you're up there clicking on that part, it would also be great if you could hit that subscribe button too, as well as the little bell for notifications of further uploads. So you can see now here I'm going in with the green wash and just sort of dabbing it, and you know, little splodges anywhere that the water would, or the rain and stuff would settle down, and so it would allow moss to grow. So this is the green staining of that moss that I'm applying, ready for the moss of the later stage to be applied over the top of this. This just gives it a little bit of background colour and sort of spread out. So I apply this to all the areas that I want the moss to be, you know, up and down the column, as well as some of the areas on the statue. So you can see I'm just coming up from the base of the statue as the moss would spread up, and from anywhere where that water would collect. And so we'll jump ahead and we'll be back in just a bit. Okay, so now that our shade for our skulls is dried, we can now apply a highlight. For this I'm using the Flayed One Flesh, and just very carefully dry brushing over the top of all the skulls. There's not a lot of paint on this brush, it is a very dried out brush. I've removed as much of the paint as possible so that I can apply this to the level that I want. If there was too much paint on there, it would apply it too quick, and it may build up quicker than I like. So very thin down, oh sorry, not thin down, very dried off. It's important to have a dry brush for this. And then I'm just building up the highlights as I like. I'm not too fussed about some of the highlight here going onto the stonework. Obviously I'm trying not to, but if it does, it just adds a little level of highlight to some of that stonework. So once that's done, we can then skip ahead and start on the next piece. Okay, so moving on, I'm now using a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror to paint the roses. Obviously you could do these with a red if you wished, or you could do, you know, some people have been doing yellows and blues, but I decided to go for the pink roses here. So I'm just applying this over all of the roses, both on the statue and the base. I also went ahead and painted the leaves on the base in the same greens that we did for the ones on the column here. So I'm just making sure to get a nice even coverage over all these roses, and then as usual we can then shade them down and then brush some highlight over the top. So we'll skip ahead to the shading, and I can show you what I've done for that. Okay, so just before shading the roses, I'm just taking some moot green here, and I'm just going to go around all the leaves and pick off the edges, starting from the point of the leaf and coming down to just over halfway down the leaf, sort of feathering off as I come down. And this will just give a nice little pop to those leaves. So obviously I do this on both sides of the statue, and the same with the base, and then we can move on to shading the roses. Okay, so with the leaves highlighted, I'm now going to take some Carabird Crimson, and you could use Druky Violet for this. I have done before, but I wanted a little bit more of a reddish tint to these. So I am literally just blobbing in a small amount into each rose, just allowing that to settle down into the depths of the rose, and then once that dries, that will just have a darker centre to the roses, and it will get lighter as the petals come up. So we'll just skip on to the highlighting, and we are close to being done. Right, so as you can see here, I went ahead and applied the Athonian Camo shade to the base in very much the same method, and I'm now using the brush that I use for stippling, as it makes a very good dry brush as well, and just showing that I've mixed a small amount of the white scar into the pink mix that we have, and I'm just ever so lightly touching this across the tops of the roses just to give them a lighter pink highlight, obviously being careful not to get this on the green leaves. But for such an old beaten up brush, I have to say this is a very useful brush, great for a few many things. Okay, so with the statue glued into place, we are now towards the end of the video here, and you can see that I've got some watered down PVA there. It's about a 2-to-1 mix of PVA to water. You could probably get away with maybe a 50-50 mix, and I'm just applying this to the majority of the areas that I've done with the Athonian camo shade, so the green areas, and pretty much anywhere that I want the flocking to go for the collected moss. So obviously some areas where the water would have collected, sort of in between them skulls, if there's a large gap between some skulls, then I've gone in and filled it with that. So just applying this glue to the areas that I want, and then I'm just sprinkling on a mix of flock in here. I can't remember which supplier this is, but obviously any fine grain flock will do. Just make sure it tints more towards the darker side, or as you can see here where I've got a mix of lights and darks, and this does give a nice moss effect. So all I'm going to do is just apply this to the areas that I want it, let it dry for a minute or two, and then tap off the excess, and then we can come back and have a look at the final piece. So once again, thanks a lot for joining me, guys. I hope you did enjoy the video. As you can see, this is the finished piece. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that thumbs up button, and please consider subscribing. It does help the channel grow, and you'll if you hit that little notification bell, you'll get notifications of when new videos go up. As this is a Mortal Realms magazine series, we are doing this every Monday with each issue. So yeah, until next time, guys, take it easy and paint those minis.